And it's once more on my part to say hello again to our lecture series, and it's a great pleasure to now introduce Eva Mergen, another colleague from the US here, and she has that really valuable link preserved in herself to be not only a living history professional and of course, especially when it comes to textiles and historic textile crafts. She worked for a colonial Pennsylvania plantation for quite some years, and is also, and this is the link, studying in distance program experimental archaeology at UCD Dublin, and therefore she knows the potential of where and how we can link experimental archaeology to the sites, to the living history sites, to the archaeological open air museums. So we're really looking forward to your talk, and great to have you here.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first trip to Germany, so this is very exciting. As Klaus said, I have worked as a demonstrator in historic textiles since about 2001. I demonstrate many time periods going back to about 3000 BCE all the way up to 18th century. So I've got that background in historic textiles. I have also, for the past 7 years, worked for Colonial Pennsylvania Plantation as an assistant farmer and a historic skills coordinator. So that's my living history background. As Klaus said, I am also studying experimental archaeology through a wonderful distance learning program offered by University College Dublin in Ireland. This is their first year of that program, but it has been absolutely fantastic, and I highly recommend it to anybody who is looking for more of a background in experimental archaeology. So I'm going to be talking about how these two things link together, how they support each other, how they encourage each other, and how they can collaborate. I'm going to start off by sort of giving a little bit of background for both sides of it, and then we'll talk about how they come together. So living history evolved in the United States in the era of Disneyland and Disney World. Actually, I should advance my slide. Both of these had an area that they called Main Street USA. And this was a very quintessential, to the point of being not realistic portrayal of small town America. And these were such popular attractions at these sites that the existence of these altered how people both perceived their own history, as well as how they expected to see history portrayed to them. So it was a huge shift in sort of the presentation of history in the United States. Additionally, these theme parks are huge, very sensory intense experiences. And so it created an American consumer that expected these very immersive experiences. So in this environment, you have living history sites starting to form where they are trying to capitalize on that market of people looking for these experiences. And so these living history sites also attempted to create these very immersive experiences. Often they were somewhat theatrical, very much sort of with the tagline, with the idea that you can step back in history, so that you can experience history, which is great for entertainment, and it provided what people referred to as edutainment, educational entertainment. However, it does have drawbacks. So we can't actually know what the past was like. We just simply cannot. We have good guesses. We have some evidence to work on, but we can't actually know what the past was like. So by telling people at these sites that they are stepping back in history, we put the idea in their minds that this is what it was actually like. And it can create misconceptions, it can create biases and things like that. So while these sites are very good entertainment, there is a push now to also try to make them better history. So that's where living history forms. So now we'll step over experimental archaeology. Unlike living history, experimental archaeology developed as an academic pursuit. And over the course of experimental archaeology, over the past 100 years, it has changed and evolved sort of in response to changing ideas about academia and studies. So in the beginning of experimental archaeology, it was more focused on a highly rigorous scientific practice. And this was in part because it was a newer discipline. It was trying to gain traction in the academic world, and it wanted to be taken seriously. And so it was very rigorous, very scientific. Later on in the late 70s and into the 80s, you see a pendulum swing where there became a new focus on experience, like the experience of it, the sensory perceptions of these experiments that were carried out. And many people said it swung too far and it lost some of its academic substance. We're now at a point where hopefully the pendulum is balancing itself out, and experimental archaeology is taking the best of both of these approaches, because both approaches have value and have something to contribute to our understanding of history. So that's a background of both of those. And so now we'll talk about how do they link up. So for many living history professionals, this is something that they have sort of learned on the job or learned by doing. And it's sort of, to a certain extent, taken at face value. At the site where I worked, we would train our staff and we would teach them, here's what you say, here's what you do. And so they're delivering this. However, experimental archaeology, you don't need to have gone to years of university to take the principles of experimenting, the mindset of experimentation, and apply it to these living history sites. And what it takes is it takes a shift in mindset. It takes that asking why, asking what if, asking how. And so by giving living history professionals this toolbox of experimental archaeology, they can gain a deeper understanding for what it is that they're doing. And I'll digress with a short personal story. Like I said, when I first started working at Colonial Pennsylvania Plantation, I was trained in giving farm tours. And I gave my farm tours and I talked about the animals and what their jobs were and what they did. And I did a fine job. A couple years into working there, I actually started doing farm work on the site. I actually drove the oxen. I drove the horses. I was behind a plow. And I noticed a drastic shift in how I was presenting this information to the public, because it was no longer something that I had intellectually learned. It was something I had experienced. And so there's the experience, but then you can take that even a step further and use the toolboxes of experimental archaeology to get to understanding how it is that we know that information. So, like I said, by giving living history professionals this toolbox that they can use, even without going to years of university for it, they can get a deeper understanding of what it is that they're doing. experimental archaeology for sites that interpret time periods of written history, experimental archaeology can also help those sites interpret what they're seeing in their written or pictorial records for their location and their time period. Again, for southeastern Pennsylvania in the 18th century, there are various written accounts, and sometimes you read those written accounts and you go, really? And you wonder, am I understanding them correctly? So again, you can apply those tools of experimental archaeology, that why, that how, that experimentation, and you can start to analyze what is in that written record. And so for me, one of the biggest, so those are two very important things that experimental archaeology can provide to living history. But living history at its core is a public interaction. It's engaging with the public. And so experimental archaeology can help the interpreters have a deeper understanding of what it is that they're doing, but it can also help us basically tell a better story to the visiting public. So we're no longer telling the story, you are back in history, this is what it was like, immersive experience. We can engage the public in doing these experiments, in exploring how it is that we having a problem? Okay. Exploring. Here.
I'm not in front yet.
Do it. Yeah, I'll get it.
Thank you.
And actually, I'm realizing I'm not used to doing PowerPoint, so I have gone well beyond where I am. Keep forgetting to advance my slides. I apologize. So we can engage the public in understanding how we know what we know and how we know what we don't know. So rather than them thinking that they're getting an accurate representation of history, it gives them those critical thinking skills to understand their history better, understand how we learn these things and how we gain this information. So we have, and it can still be fun. It can still be educational entertainment because this stuff is a lot of fun to do. Doing the experiments, doing that hands-on work is a lot of fun. So it's a way to engage the public in a different way. So I've talked a lot about what living history gains from experimental archaeology. Experimental archaeology also gains from living history. And it's actually for each one of the things that I talked about before, it's two sides of the same coin, so to speak. So for experimental archaeology, and I think maybe I should be advancing a slide. For experimental archaeology, what living history offers is many people who are trained in skills and who are doing these skills every day. So part of this whole reality of trying to create this immersive experience is that people needed things to use, clothing to wear, leatherwork, woodwork. And so this culture of living history fostered many, many artisans to gain the skills necessary to create those reproductions that would be used in living history. So they have, and the best way to make it look like it was made in the past is to make it the way they made it in the past. So we have a vast network of people with the skills to do these things who are living it on a daily basis. And there's a different kind of understanding that comes from living something on a daily basis, doing it again and again, moving it from mental knowledge to muscle memory, to intrinsic understanding, and all of these things. So living history offers that network of people who have these skills. And if we harness those people towards these experiments, you get a wonderful collaboration and a wonderful cooperation. So again, you give the craftspeople some of the toolbox of experimental archaeology. Experimental archaeology gets people who live these skills every day. and not only can provide the skills themselves, but can also help direct the questions that are being asked. Because when you do something again and again, you start to go, wait a second, what if I did it this way? Or you understand a material in a different way. Likewise, like I said earlier, that experimental archaeology gives living history professionals a different way to interact with the public. Living history gives experimental archaeology that access to the public. So it gives experimental archaeology a way to get to the broader world what is learned by the experiments that are done. So it's a way to communicate it to a broader public. Living history has a well-established experience with telling these stories, with getting people engaged in hands-on activities and things like that. And so by giving the information learned in experimental archaeology to living history can then give that information to the general public in a way that makes it accessible, interesting, and fun to participate in. And by doing that, you plant the seeds for those future generations, hopefully, of experimental archaeologists and living history professionals. One experimental archaeology named Martin Bell, in a paper that he wrote, he talked about all these concepts. He talked about the fact that experimental archaeology needs to bring together ethnographers, anthropologists, scientists, and skilled professionals. And he also talked about the fact that these sites are inspiring future generations. So that is my hope. By bringing these two worlds together, we can help each other grow, help each other find new ways of doing things, help each other find new ways of presenting this all to the broader world. And so, oh, and I'm sure I forgot to advance a slide. So just another picture. So thank you for having me. Hopefully this was good.
Thank you so much, Eva. And of course it was good. It was really good. And it was exactly what we're looking for, and showing people how this great potential on both sides can be, or has to be, taken seriously and has to be taken advantage of. And so we're just take the member directory of LFM or the member directory of XARC, and you could see so many skilled professionals, so many living history folks which done this for 40 years or longer, being even academic at times. And so we really have to think more in networking. And the Year in the Field project you also see on site is one of these approaches to bring also these organizations together, these professionals together, to start to talk with each other. So the floor is open for questions. Gibt es Fragen aus dem Publikum? Lauren.
I do have a question about the two of them together. So when you're in period clothing, you have, and then using period supplies for your entire setup, it does give you restrictions and benefits. And as I was watching Klaus's experiment with the arrows, I was thinking, what if he was constricted by all of the supplies, you know, and then being able to take something out in the right amount of time and do something.
Right.
Talk about this.
Right, exactly. So it adds another layer to our understanding to be doing these things in period clothing. So, for example, I interpreted that's me there. I interpreted in 18th century clothing, which includes women's stays, which are a restrictive garment. And so understanding how that changes how it is when I'm driving an ox and things like that. So you can easily do these experiments in regular street clothing, but again, it by doing things in period clothing with period tools, it adds another layer of understanding, another way of approaching it, another way of experiencing it.
And I mean, thinking about the Middle Ages or the early Middle Ages, at some point you can't really tell what the clothes for a specific trade looked like, or what the details were in every kind of sense. So sometimes maybe first get the trade and the skill right, and then think about that as an additional parameter to take care of.
Yeah.
Any further questions? Questions from online? Any from the chat? Okay, is that not the case? Thank you again. And